the case may be, I am turning to Professor Tim Lindberg. He is a professor of political science at University of Minnesota Morris. He also teaches the psychology of voting and political behavior. Welcome to the show, Professor Lindberg. So great to have you today.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Roshini.
I know you've been listening to the show on and off today, and you heard some questions from earlier and probably also heard some of the opinions of people talking about voting and different political opinions. It's an emotional topic, isn't it?
It really is. And, I think the biggest thing that people struggle with, I think, with talking about politics in general, especially when you get this contentious and people are polarized and partisan, is remembering that we have far more in common, many of us, than we do separate, and that we do distinct from one another, that we have a lot of common values and that we need to rely on those common values and then talk about our differences within those. And it becomes very difficult, particularly when everything feels so real and that, your team or your candidate losing is the end of the world and the other team or other candidate winning is the end of the world.
Why do you think it is, Professor Lindberg, that we've really seen in the last several years people's inability to just have differences of opinion? We heard from Dan just before we came to you before the break, and I know Dan is a regular listener of the show. I so appreciate his loyalty to my show, but he really wants to, get more people to agree with him. I am okay with voting the way I'm going to vote or having my opinion, and I don't care personally if anyone agrees with me or not. Why are Americans getting such visceral reactions?
I think there's two things I would say to that question. It's a great question. The first is that I think there's too much emphasis put on persuading other people to think like you or that you're correct. And one of the things that I always, try to get across in my classes on political psychology and voting behavior is that you simply aren't going to persuade very many people ever with your political ideals. And of course, if you push them hard, you're going to persuade even fewer people. They're going to clam up. They're going to be defensive and reinforce their own beliefs. So one thing is just to not really necessarily go out there with the intent to persuade other people, but instead to think about it as a way to describe what your values are and why you believe the things you do, and then hope the other person takes that into consideration with how they vote and how they think about policies, rather than necessarily saying, I'm a liberal, you need to be a liberal too, or I'm a conservative and you need to be conservative. So I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing, which is really true over the last few years, is the rise in misinformation, the rise in, people looking at certain types of media as fake or misleading or partisan in a way that not only drives them to disregard it, but then also to disregard any sort of fact-based evidence, right? It's very hard to say when people are out there saying places like Associated Press, Reuters, CNN, New York Times are all fake news because they're liberal bastions of news. Well, it's really hard because where do we all turn that we all agree is talking the same language and giving us the facts and evidence about what's going on.
Really well explained. I'm talking with Professor Tim Lindberg. He teaches the class American Democracy in Action at the University of Minnesota Morris. He is a political scientist, and we are talking about the psychology of political participation and voting behavior. If you have a question or comment for him, give us a call, give us a text, 651-989-9226. I would love for him to give you his insight because it's always interesting to hear about sort of the psychology of this behavior. Let's go to the question that I got in the 9 a.m. hour, Professor, from, I believe it was Sandy, from a listener who's really trying to be diligent and study the different races, specifically her local races, but she's a little overwhelmed with how does she even start to do that?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think, and one other aspect of the caller's question was the point of we should actually care more about our local elections than we do, and we should care less about the national elections than we do, right? It's all about Biden versus Trump, but what's going to impact your life on a daily basis is more who wins city council if you have kids, who's on the school board, who's the mayor of your local town, depending on the structure of politics in the area. And it can be very hard to find information on those local candidates. This is part of the reason that there's been, particularly among political scientists, such a strong dislike of the dissolution of a lot of local papers, particularly in rural towns or smaller areas. But even in suburban areas where they have these weekly periodicals, but they typically try to stay away from politics. They may not, they kind of talk about recycling dates and different things that are going on, but they don't delve too deeply into politics because they don't want to be seen as partisan or getting into the political realm. And so it's very hard to find information. I think some of those newspapers do a good job of at least providing candidates a forum. So you might see, and typically papers will try to do this on a regular basis at some point before the election if they're weeklies, where they show candidates, so they give candidates a chance to have a 500-word column about why they're running, why you should vote for them. So that's one thing I would definitely look for. And another thing that is harder this year with COVID is just meeting candidates. I know Devin was talking about running into a candidate for mayor and Becker. And that's a great way to do it. And of course, in normal years when we don't have to worry about social distancing as much, that is something that's a lot easier to do. Candidates will do events, even in smaller cities or towns, and you can go and meet them if you're interested. I think that's a great way to go and figure out who you should vote for those local elections. This year it's much harder. Sometimes they're still doing maybe virtual events or maybe outdoor events if it's warm enough, but it does become very difficult to figure out who these candidates are and who you should vote for.
Along those lines, a great text coming in from this listener who says, I voted by mail this year, even though in the past years I might have gotten a sample ballot in the mail before I went to my polling location. There were a lot of races that I did not know anything about the candidates. This year, with my ballot in front of me, I was able to research the candidates of the lesser known races, county, city judges. This was probably my most informed voting experience. Well, way to go, listener. I love that this listener took matters into their own hands, Professor Lindberg, and didn't just wait around for someone to tell them what to do or even skip a particular line on the ballot.
Right. And I think that's a great way to think about it. I think I've heard from a lot of people that are, they say, yeah, I'm missing out on the sort of the feeling, the civic duty you have if you go in and vote. That moment is really important, I think, for a lot of people. But sitting at home and being able to say, okay, I can stop here in the middle of my ballot even, right, if you don't have enough time to research it right then, or mark a couple races and be like, I'm going to come back to this, is a huge benefit to a lot of people who really take that seriously. And one of the things I think is interesting about this is, I think people don't realize that they've been able to technically do that for years and years. The Secretary of State's website always has a sample ballot that you can go and look at. And so you can do this on your own, even if you're going to, say, vote in person on November 3rd this year, right? Go look at that sample ballot online. It'll be the same one you see when you go in, and it will have all those races. And if you don't recognize names, or if you're not sure and there's a contested race, you can do the research and find out that information. And it works the exact same way as this listener pointed out. And it's a really great way to engage and be conscientious about your voting choices.
And speaking of the Secretary of State, I'm so excited to let my listeners know that this Wednesday, October 7th, Professor Tim Lindberg and Secretary of State Simon and I will share the stage, the virtual stage, when I moderate a panel. They will be the panelists. It's called Your Vote is Your Voice, sponsored by the University of Minnesota Alumni Association, the University of Minnesota Morris, among others. And if you want to register for that, folks, just go to my website, ownyourwow.com. Go to the calendar page. You'll look at October 7th. You'll see the link to the registration over on the U of M Alumni Association's page. I'm really excited. It's 12 to 1 o'clock, so real simple. So anyone out there who wants more information about voting around the state, you'll hear directly from Professor Lindberg and the Secretary of State, Steve Simon. I think it's going to be really fun, Professor.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that session. And I looking at the questions that people are already submitting, and make sure you do submit a question if you have one ahead of time for that event. If you're going to listen in, a lot of the questions are really good questions and really important questions about the process, particularly in light of what's going on with COVID-19 this year. Concerns about how long the mail might take. When does your ballot have to be there? Getting a ballot in the mail and then going to vote in person. Those types of questions that are really important and people are really worried about. We'll talk about those, and we'll give you answers that really can help you work through all the process and make sure that your vote counts.
A double shot of Professor Lindberg this week. Thanks so much, Professor Tim Lindberg. He is a political scientist from the University of Minnesota Morris. We'll have you back, and I will catch you virtually on Wednesday during our panel together. Have a great Sunday.
All right. Thank you.